Welcome to RSG Insider, where we discuss issues facing local jurisdictions. My name is Tara Matthews, and I'm a principal at RSG, and today I'm joined by Cindy Blot, who is an expert in federal funding compliance. Welcome, Cindy. Nice to have you today. Before we get started, can you maybe talk a little bit about your background and experience with federal funding compliance?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Tara. My name's Cindy Blot. I am a senior associate here with RSG. I've been in local government type jobs for over 15 years. I specialize in federal grant compliance and federal rules and regulations.
So quite a bit of experience dealing with federal funding regulations and making sure people stay off of any naughty list.
I try.
You try to do that. RSG assists many jurisdictions with compliance efforts related to federal funding, such as ARPA, CDBG, home funds, and whatnot. Can you explain or describe for the audience today a little bit more about what is federal funding compliance? What does that mean?
Sure. So the government releases billions of dollars a year. Most of it is received at the state or local jurisdiction level. All of these various funding sources have explicit instructions on how you can use the funds, and how you can remain compliant. HUD and other federal programs do come and monitor programs, so it's important that local jurisdictions know what the rules and regulations are of all the grant requirements so that when they do get their monitoring visit, they're in complete compliance.
So it sounds like there's a lot of rules and regulations to follow. What happens if somebody doesn't follow the rules?
So there are consequences if the rules are not followed or the grant requirements are not adhered to. One of the most important things to remember is that at any time they can claw back the money. If you're not utilizing it correctly, the money has to be given back. It has to be given back with general funds, not with the grant funds. There are also administrative fines and penalties. If it's a blatant misuse of funds, there could be criminal penalties.
Wow. Sounds like we really want to get this right. And it also sounds like something that I would not want to go to my city council to have to explain any misuse of funds or clawbacks or any criminal activities. So, how is it that consultants can help in this process?
Right. So as I mentioned, there's billions of dollars that pour into local governments, and most don't have a subject matter expert on that particular sort of funding. So where RSG steps in is that we do have subject matter experts who have extensive experience with compliance. We have the staff and the resources to dig deep into those rules and regulations and work with cities as they implement the programs so that they're following the rules, utilizing the funds wisely, and remain compliant with the federal government.
Yeah, this doesn't sound like an area where you want to stray outside of the boundaries.
And that's a really good point, because I don't think that people who find themselves in trouble ever intended to get into trouble. They just didn't understand the extent of the requirements.
Can you describe a little bit more and talk about, how federal funds in general impact affordable housing and community development?
Yeah, so there are several programs that come from the federal government and state as well that support affordable housing development. So affordable housing, as you know, is a big topic throughout the state of California. Trying to leverage funds is very difficult, tax credits, etc. The funds that come from the federal government are intended to help cities fill that gap. So many developers will apply for tax credits, for example, and lending, and there's often a gap in that financing. Federal funds fill that gap and allow cities to create beautiful affordable housing developments and more of them.
And then federal funds can also be used for community development efforts as well, not just affordable housing. Is that correct?
Yeah, so a number of the programs focus on housing, as we have talked about, but they also want the community to be safe. So there are a lot of the fundings that come from the government can be used for playgrounds, sidewalk improvements, and economic development efforts as well. So we've worked with a number of cities to create economic development programs for small businesses, advancing businesses, and even job skills training programs.
It sounds like federal funds are really instrumental to both affordable housing and community development. Can you provide an example of one particular federal funding requirement? I know there's many of them, but maybe today we can just kind of focus in on one just so people can kind of understand the general process.
Yeah, I think that great point. So one of the most vital requirements is to have a plan. And when I speak about a plan, I'm talking about a consolidated plan, not just a plan on how you're going to spend that one source of funding, but a consolidated plan that talks about how you're going to utilize all your funding sources. So, for example, HUD requires local jurisdictions who receive CDBG, Home, ESG, HOPWA, and other federal funds to create a 5-year consolidated plan. Within that plan, they have to do a lot of community outreach, they have to talk to service providers, and they have to provide to HUD an actual 5-year strategic plan with community input, key stakeholder input, that addresses all the needs within that local jurisdiction. So it's comprehensive. It provides input from all the key stakeholders and residents, as well as the city council or county commissioners.
So it sounds like a very comprehensive process with a lot of engagement and feedback from stakeholders, and I'm sure the jurisdictions themselves and residents alike. Can you talk a little bit more about the community input and kind of the planning process for community input and engagement?
Yeah, so this is actually my favorite part of working with local governments, is that we get to do that outreach on their behalf. So we set up community workshops, community input sessions, and we go into local libraries, schools, wherever they want to hold these meetings, and we discuss what the funding is for, what it can be utilized for, some of the programs already in existence, and then we actually do a Q&A and an input session. It allows the community to ask us questions. What's the funding for? How has it been used in the past? What is the intent? And it gives the citizens an opportunity to weigh in on how this money should be spent to improve their own communities. Again, it's my favorite part. I do like to do the outreach and meet the people in the community and hear their needs. The consolidated plan has to include input on local needs, and who better to get that information from than the local citizens.
Sounds like a really great way for a citizen to be able to participate in the local government process. I mean, they literally are giving direct feedback to that jurisdiction on how funds that were provided from the federal government can be utilized and things that might affect them very quickly.
You hit the nail on the head. That's the intent of the citizen outreach and citizen participation plan requirement.
Yeah, that's really cool. Can you maybe talk a little bit about, from your experience in developing these plans of some common pitfalls that jurisdictions may want to avoid in this process?
Yeah, so there are some very common pitfalls, and it really is very simple. It's usually because somebody has not read all of the requirements in the contract they've signed with the federal government. Again, this is where our expertise, we read these contracts over and over, working with local jurisdictions. As I mentioned earlier, nobody intends to be out of compliance, but they may read it and not understand it and think, well, they've handled other federal funding sources, they'll just keep doing what they're doing. And that might work for a bit, but it doesn't work long term. You have to dig deep into the rules and requirements of every single funding source, and then have a policies and procedures manual for that funding source. I think this is where we've been instrumental, is we've not only assisted local jurisdictions with understanding what the funds are used for. RSG helps jurisdictions create policies and procedures so that all staff members involved will know that there's a manual they can go to if they have questions. And then, of course, they can call us with any additional questions.
Yes, we've definitely had calls from clients where HUD was auditing and looking at these various requirements to ensure that everything was being spent properly. So it's definitely very, very important that jurisdictions get this right. It's definitely not a government regulation or rule that is there that nobody is checking on. They take this very seriously. And it sounds like these plans then that get developed have to be reported out on progress routinely to check and ensure that compliance is being met. Is that correct?
Yes. So the plan is first submitted to HUD, the Consolidated Plan, and then they approve it. Okay, you've said what you're going to do. We approve what you're going to do. Then there's also an annual action plan that is submitted that says, okay, these are the goals and the needs. This is this year, specifically with this year's worth of funding. This is how we're going to do it. At the end of that year, they have to do an annual performance report. It's called a CAPER. And that states exactly what they did with the money, how many people benefited. And along the way, HUD is monitoring all of these activities. So what they say they're going to do in their con plan, what they actually, the actions to do it are in the annual action plan. And then the CAPER is where they have to document every single thing they've done and every single penny spent. And then each of these 3 documents are approved by HUD throughout
the process. Wow. Yeah, sounds very complex. Do other federal funds kind of require the same type of thing?
Yes. So recently, because of ARPA, again, billions of dollars were poured into local governments. And again, it was another federal funding source with a whole nother set of rules. So yes, each of the funding sources requires specific rules and regulations, and the federal government changes these rules. They'll do waivers on certain requirements, but the waiver could only be for a short period of time, not the entire length of the funding grant. So it's really important that local jurisdictions, if they're receiving these funds, to be very careful in understanding all the rules and requirements, all the changes that are made, and stay on top of all the correspondence with the federal government about any changes, waivers, and termination of waivers.
Sounds like a lot of information to track. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise with us, and thank you for tuning in today.